Hi, I'm James Gann, founder and director of Manna. Manna began back in 2018, and from the beginning, our focus has very much been twofold. Number one, we have an incredible heart for encouraging and strengthening pastors in Southern California, specifically pastors that lead what we call seedling churches, or churches that have been recently planted or maybe smaller. These are churches that tend to get overlooked in the church landscape. Our heart from the beginning has been to be an encouragement to them, to tell them to keep going, keep pressing on. Ultimately, we want to see them be sustainable. We want to see their churches and their pastoral careers have longevity. And so that has been a focus from the very beginning with Manna. So the second thing that Manna has been about from its beginning is mercy and justice. Manna is a ministry of mercy and justice, and this really exhibits itself in multiple ways. Number one, from the beginning, we have been about empowering the local church to act with mercy and justice towards their community. Number two, from the beginning, we've been about acting with mercy and justice towards the local church. And what I mean by that is the churches that we've tended to serve, those churches that may be considered the least of these on the church landscape, those churches have been our focus from the beginning to strengthen and encourage those churches. And then finally, number three, as it relates to mercy and justice, it's not enough just to mercifully give out resources and grants, but that we would act with justice towards churches. And that means that we see churches as equal with one another, that each church has a story, each church is valued the same by God, each church has a calling. And so the message of mercy and justice is very much at Manna's core. My wife and I planted a church in 2010 that unfortunately didn't make it. And that was a really difficult time for us, but it was also educational. And, we experienced the highs and the lows, the ups and the downs, the grind, the daily grind, the weekly grind. We experienced those relationships that were there and then they weren't. But coming away from that, our hope, our dream was always that one day we would pastor and plant again. And as time moved on, we really sensed that as our business was growing and God was blessing it, that God was actually calling us to lay that dream and hope down, that we would actually serve others and support and strengthen others that have that dream. And so it's beautiful how from the ashes of failure, God can do something tremendous. And that really became the genesis for how Manna started. In the beginning, Manna started by giving out grants to seedling churches. Since its inception, Manna has given out over $500,000 in grants, and we've impacted over 70 churches in Southern California. Cool thing with Manna, there's no hook, there's no string, there's no such thing as a quote, Manna church. It is a ministry of grace, and we firmly believe in that. But what we've seen as grants have been given out and as communities have been impacted and as lives have been changed, we've also been able to build relationships with these local churches. And as we look to the future, very much of what Manna is doing is through those relationships that we've built with local churches. It's through these relationships that we've really gotten to know these churches and know their stories, and it's just a beautiful thing. Through relationship, we've really come to understand mercy and justice towards the church at a much deeper level. See, it's not enough just to be merciful and to create a welfare system, so to speak, where we just continue to pour money into churches. We will continue to pour money into churches, but being merciful is not enough. Justice as well is needed. And what justice says about the church is it says that all churches are equal. All churches have value. All churches have dignity. And if that's the case, then we need to help churches come to a place of sustainability. We need to help churches come to a place of longevity where their stories carry on and on and on. With sustainability in mind, starting in 2022, we started to build out platforms that would minister to local churches to help them become more sustainable, to get more rooted, again, so that we could see them have longevity. Most churches tend to fail in these areas that we've identified: economic sustainability, financial sustainability, administrative sustainability. When you talk about pastoral rhythms and marital rhythms and ecclesiological sustainability, administrative sustainability, these are areas that churches tend to fail in. These are the areas that our church unfortunately failed in. Our hope is that by 2024, we'll have all 7 of these platforms completed as we look to kingdom partnerships and also original content to complete them. When you look at Galatians 2, you see that the apostles commissioned Paul and Barnabas to go to the Gentiles, but they did ask him. They asked him to remember the poor. And as you look at Paul's ministry, he's oftentimes taking up a collection to remember specifically the poor, the church in Jerusalem. And fast forward to 2 Corinthians 8, and Paul is exhorting the church in Corinth to come through on basically the promise that they had made to support the church in Jerusalem. Keep in mind, this was a church they didn't know, that they'd probably never been to and had never seen, and yet Paul's exhorting them to come to the aid of their brothers and sisters in Jerusalem. And it's interesting that he uses manna as an illustration, and he says that churches that maybe had gathered much didn't have too much, and that churches that maybe have gathered little wouldn't have too little. And he talked about operating in fairness, and that fairness, that means equality. And so for us, we really have a heart to see the church in Southern California operate in equality. We believe that there's an equality, there's a rightness that God calls to the church, and in that we find unity. The name Manna is very much rooted in this idea of fairness or equality or justice amongst the churches. It's very much this idea, like Paul talked about, that those churches that had little would still have enough, and those churches that have much would be able to come to their aid. You know, when Manna first started and we named it Manna, our hope from the beginning was that churches, gospel-minded patrons here in Southern California would really come alongside these churches and support and strengthen them. These churches that may lack, that they would still have enough. And so just like Paul was asked, we would ask you, will you remember them with us? Maybe you're a church that has an abundance that can help and give and resource some of these younger churches or churches that are lacking. Maybe you're a local patron that out of your plenty, you want to give to something that is going to impact the kingdom, something that is going to absolutely empower the local church to impact its community. Or maybe you're a church that just has tons of understanding and wisdom and experience that could be given to a local church, a young church, or a young pastor. Maybe there's pastors out there that would love to mentor or father some of these younger pastors. When we talk about plenty, giving to those that lack, that can be done in so many ways. It doesn't only mean money or finances. And so we ask you today, would you remember with us these churches that are doing incredible things in their community, that are reaching the lost. You know the statistics with church plants. Church plants are so effective at reaching the lost. We ask you, would you remember them today? Would you stand with us and remember them? And we humbly ask you to pray about these things. We thank you.